All right. Hey, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon if you're in London, and good evening if you're in Ethiopia today. We've been trying to get together, Graham Peebles and I. I'm really excited about this conversation. It's a lot of what we've talked about along this year, crazy year, but I think that Graham did a really good job putting it in article form. Graham Peebles, a UK-based writer, has also lived in Ethiopia. Thank you so much for making the time to have this conversation.
Well, it's a pleasure. It's very nice to be here at last, Camilla.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a lot to coordinate here with these time zones. So I was reading this article that you wrote that was published in CounterPunch titled Western Lies and False Narratives About Ethiopia. I was literally almost jumping out of my seat because I felt like, oh my gosh, somebody else gets it to this degree. And I just thought it was really interesting how you were able to hit on a lot of different elements. One being just the leaning into sort of the African stereotypes or the stereotypes, the race stereotypes, how easy it was to just throw out the word famine or war, and people just kind of thought, okay, this is what's going on in Ethiopia. So sort of paint a broad picture of what you were seeing or witnessing as it relates to the Western propaganda.
Well, I think it was, the Western coverage of the conflict in Ethiopia has been disgraceful. You can't read all of the coverage, but and some has been worse than others. But the bias and the misrepresentation, the level of lazy journalism, the media, the media is not neutral. When we talk about the media, we mean the mainstream big organizations. So the BBC, CNN, and then people like Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and these publications. Now, of course, they would refute allegations that they were biased, and they would refute allegations that they were spreading propaganda. Was the coverage malicious? So I don't know whether it was malicious or not, but it had a malicious impact because it did the media plays an active role in wars. It's not a bystander. I mean, if you look at what's happening at the moment, the media coverage of the Russian buildup of troops on the Ukraine border, it's beyond belief, really. Russia has no intention of invading Ukraine. It never has had any intention of invading Ukraine. Well, unless I'm completely wrong, but it doesn't seem that he has to me. But the media is presenting a particular image, and it's a stereotype that fits the stereotypical image of Russia in the same way that the image that was presented of Ethiopia played into a stereotype of Africa. And that stereotype is one that reinforces the colonial model. Colonialism hasn't ended. Imperialism hasn't ended. It's just changed its shape. Africa is still under the rule of the Western powers. The political economic systems, the strangulating hold that debt has on the country, the selling of a particular idea of development, all of these things maintain Western control of the continent. And the media is part of that system of control. And in relationship to the conflict in Ethiopia, which was a terrorist gang launching a treacherous attack on a democratically elected government. So that's a fact. That's not an opinion from somebody who supports a particular view. That's a fact. The government is the first democratically elected government in Ethiopia, which is an amazing achievement and was virtually ignored by Western media and the Western powers. The TPLF were a monstrous organization when they were in power, and they're a monstrous organization now. They should be completely and utterly disbanded. They should be disarmed and disbanded, in my opinion. But, you know, Prime Minister Abiy is being much more understanding than many of us would like him to be. However, that basic premise from which the conflict arose was virtually ignored by the Western media. So why? You know what? It's if there's the hint of a terrorist attack in America or Europe or Britain, there's outrage. You know, so there was none of that outrage. There was no recognition of what had happened. And then once the conflict started, the Western media seemed to take their lead from Western governments. You know, whatever the US said, the British followed, and the European powers did the same, more or less. And then the Western media, who seemed to get most of their material from, you know, the US State Department or press briefings from the governments, just repeated what they were saying. Now, they hid behind the fact that there was a lockdown in Tigray in the early parts of the conflict. But there's always a lockdown when there's a conflict.
Right.
You know, whenever there's a war, you can't access the area where there's a war because it's obviously not safe. So instead of saying that and just presenting the little material that they had, they inflamed a particular narrative which undermined the government, consistently undermined the government. You know, and then you have the Americans imposing sanctions, which is a form of economic terrorism. You know, it's one of the poorest countries in the world being attacked internally by a terrorist group. And what does one of its oldest supposed allies do? They impose sanctions and they threaten to withdraw Ethiopia's economic status. And they're still doing the same now. So it's, you know, they supported the TPLF during their reign and they continued to support them when the fighting started.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is one of the more obvious things that doesn't get brought up enough that you just brought up is that that region was under lockdown. And one of the earliest signs for me of doubt of like, is this coverage objective or what is this, are they sensationalizing what's happening, which for a lot of us who had family in that region, it was just such an emotional roller coaster. I feel like a little bit of an extra advantage in terms of my journalism background because ultimately I can do a little bit more dissecting. But still, for someone who didn't really grow up there and didn't know the politics, probably you knew it way better than I did when this conflict started. But it was interesting to see the juxtaposition between the constant narration of it's under lockdown. Of course, there's an active conflict, a war going on. And then you would see these really almost detailed articles with the exact number of people that had been massacred and some names and photos eventually came out. And I know that covering a magnitude or a story of that magnitude, rather, you need more time to be able to verify that you're talking to people that are actually telling you the truth, that aren't being told what to say, because after all, this is an act of war and they're under a region that is held hostage essentially by this group that had started the war. So during the early days when you saw these articles come out, what was going through your head with as someone who kind of gets the way this works?
Well, I was confused. You know, I was really confused. And I have close people in Ethiopia. My ex is Ethiopian, she's there. And so she's very politically engaged. And she would be telling me all these stories that were completely contrary to what I was reading in the press. And she kept saying to me right from the beginning, the West is behind this, the West is behind this, the West is manipulating. And I said, why? Why would that be true? Why on earth would that be the case? And what makes you believe that? And she would often just be angry and not have any details. And I thought that doesn't make any sense, you know why? But then the more I started to talk to her and other people and do research myself, then a picture started to emerge. But Hamila, that's me. You know, that's somebody who cares deeply about the people and the country, who has contacts in the country and who has family there. So if it's difficult for me or somebody like me to find out what's going on, it's impossible for the majority of people who don't really care anyway and will believe, you know, most people don't even read the articles and read an article. And it's, you know, the article that you mentioned that I wrote recently, you know, that could have been a book. You know, it was, I don't know, 1,700 words long, and it could have been 5 times that length or a small book. And it took me 2 weeks to research. And I had loads of material. And, you know, so the BBC doesn't spend that much time on things. They don't do much investigative journalism these days. You know, most big publishing organizations, they're struggling. They don't send people to the field in the way they did 10 years ago. So so they won't investigate. You know, they'll and people believe what they're told a lot of the time. You know, I would have heated arguments with friends and all the time who say, well, you know, my Tigray friends are telling me something completely different, or The Economist tells me something completely different. Right. You know, and The Economist can't be wrong, can it? That's, you know, so, you know, you have these pillars of democracy, but they're not democratic institutions. And it's, you know, I think that's something, you know, coming into the conversation today, I think, you know, a lot of what we've said and what people will already know. And it's, I think it would be interesting to also take the conversation on into the role of the media within a vibrant democracy. You know, we don't live in democracies. You know, America isn't a democracy. Britain isn't a democracy, really. You know, Africa is evolving. Ethiopia is evolving a democracy. So that means it has a tremendous opportunity. But with I know we're moving slightly away from it, I mean, and if you want to bring me back, do. But I think it's all connected. You know, I think we have to find the connection. But within the development model and the desire for the West to maintain control of the Horn of Africa is part of the development model, and their support for the TPLF was part of their intention to maintain control of the Horn of Africa and destabilize the region. So it's within that development model, it's based on the global socioeconomic system, which is an extreme form of capitalism. So, and the media organizations are part of that. You know, they're huge corporations. They're driven by profit. They're conditioned to see the world in a particular way. Their ideology is based on the education that they've had, the history that they've read. It's a distorted history. You know, you know, you read the Western history of Ethiopia or Africa, it's a completely false perspective in lots and lots of ways. So all of these things influence what the media does when something happens in Africa. And if there's an uprising in Ethiopia seen as an insurgent force, you know, how many times did I read that? This insurgent force, this rebel group, you know, they're not an insurgent force. This is not a rebel group. And how you see the power of language, you know, the power of a word, how in the article, I mentioned the an example of the way the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is represented. And the last time the Israelis bombarded Gaza, it was reported on the BBC one day that a certain number of Israelis were killed by Palestinian bombs, and a certain number of Palestinians died by Israeli attacks. So you think, well, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's using language to convey a particular idea. The idea is the Palestinians are monsters, are terrorists killing innocent Israelis, whereas the Palestinians just died suddenly. And it's the same with that happened all the time with reporting of the Ethiopian conflict. So yes, you'd have stories that were complete misrepresentations, but more often than not, you just have this sort of stream of conditioned reporting which reinforced a particular viewpoint. It's both very subtle and extremely crude.
Right. It's subtle in the beginning when you don't have, or it can look subtle in the beginning of the conflict when you don't have enough data. But over time, and you wrote about this, when every mainstream publication is talking about a humanitarian aid blockade, a de facto blockade, which was kind of a way for them to hide behind the fact that it wasn't a full blockade. And then The Economist wrote that article you also mentioned, talking about food being used as a weapon. A lot of other publications repeated those lines. They kept talking about the concern for famine way in the beginning of the conflict. And it's just, over time you think this can't just be an accident. I mean, these people are journalists. They have had usually 10 plus years experience if they're writing if they're foreign correspondents. So, this kind of feeds into a lot of conversations, which is one, why we look at publications like The Economist, and I did before all this, or even CNN to some degree, as sort of these on a pedestal. Like, it's not possible that they would just be literally making up things and spitting out propaganda. And then also even institutions like the UN, one of the things that were really difficult for me to communicate, and still is now, with folks that were buying the TPLF narrative all this time, is they say, everyone's wrong, CNN, Economist, and the UN, how can it be? And it's like, I understand how that's hard to believe. But if you just pay attention to the details, the bias is extreme, right?
Absolutely. But it's very difficult. And but that's how all these organizations, they're all interconnected. And that's what I'm trying to say, that they all operate within the same construct. They all operate within the same political economic ideology. So they've all bought into the capitalist pseudo-democratic structures that we have in the West. This idea of development in Africa, it's not development, it's westernization. That's what they're trying to do. It's not, okay, let's explore what development might mean, in this country. What do we understand by that word? What do the people understand by that word? What should it look like? There's none of that. There's a defined model. And all of these organizations that you mentioned are part of the structures and the institutions that maintain that ideology, which is essentially an unjust ideology of control and exploitation. And I was the same. And, The Economist is slightly right wing, and you think, okay, so you read it with that thing. But there's a very good journalist who writes for The Guardian, a man called George Monbiot, who's an environmental writer and does fantastic work within the environmental issue. He wrote a piece about the conflict. which was a ridiculous thing to do. And it was wrong, it was false and incorrect from beginning to end. It was extraordinary. It talked about I can't remember when it was published. Maybe it was June. Oh, I've lost you. Oh, you're back.
Oh, yeah, I know. You were frozen too. I was kind of just waiting for it to come back.
It's probably the system fed up with me waffling on. And he talked about a coming famine like the 1980s in Tigray. And if I had known nothing about the area, and most of the world I don't know anything about, so I would have read that. Why wouldn't I have just believed it? I would have done. I would have accepted what he said. I wouldn't have cross-referenced. I wouldn't have looked into it at all. So, and then you have, the BBC. Whenever you turn on the radio, if there was any coverage at all of the Ethiopian conflict, and there wasn't a great deal, there was on the World Service perhaps. There might be a 10-minute piece, and they would say the same things. And this constant statement that the government was blocking humanitarian aid convoys. And when I first, I thought, why on earth are they doing that? And is there any truth in this? Is it? And then I can't remember when it was. When was it? October or September? When the Ethiopian government expelled.
It was September. That was a huge moment, I think, because they had gotten away with saying the blockade for, the whole time, the whole conflict, and then it leaked that the UN officials who were essentially fired for that leaked audio saying that the director of WHO, Tedros Adhanom, was orchestrating the aid with some of the other UN officials and the TPLF, and the aid had gone in, and the TPLF said it was because of shortage of fuel that it didn't come back, but it had been 2 months, and during that time they had been in other regions. That was a very, I think, pivotal month in terms of kind of the truth rising to the top.
Well, it was, Hamela, but you say that, but still, yes, for you and I'm sure it was, but I'm not sure that it was per se. I'm not sure that then people, because a lot of the coverage when the Ethiopian government expelled the UN workers, there were 7, I think, to begin with. Mm-hmm. And then a couple of weeks or 2 or 3 weeks later, they arrested a whole group of UN workers, and then drivers mainly, if I remember. But then they were subsequently released. Most of them were released, and to cast aspersions about UN aid work and UN humanitarian work, and to then suggest, which I kept doing, that it was that Tedros was part of this somehow. It smacks of conspiracies, and nobody wants to buy into a conspiracy. So it's, I'm not sure even now that these things have been recognized to be truthful. I think there needs to be independent investigations into all of these things. Probably there won't be. And something like the report that I referenced in the article by the called the New Africa Institute.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, right. They'll say that that's not independent.
They'll say it's not independent, but
basically UNI is as independent as it gets. Like that's what it comes down to.
But people don't, they don't trust me as independent, because I'm seen as having a bias towards the Ethiopian government. And there was a piece. The same article that you mentioned was also published in Nation of Change, and there was a comment. One of the comments, some guy had written, "Well, I don't claim to know much about this issue. However, this article seems to be very one-sided, and I'm sure if we spoke to somebody from Tigray or the Tigray, you'd get a completely different picture." and of course, that's what you're up against. And it's not, I had a discussion with a friend of mine, an economist reader recently, about what the media should be doing in situations like the Ethiopian situation or the current, I don't know what to call it, the current problems on the Ukraine-Russian border.
Oh, yeah.
But what should they be? What should the media's role be? And it's not. I would maintain that their role is not to be neutral. The BBC is always says it goes to enormous lengths to be neutral, and you can't be. It's impossible anyway. But what I want to know as a reader is what it's not. There is no justification, for example, for what Israel is doing. It's outrageous what they're doing in the Palestinian territories. And it's criminal on all sorts of levels. I mean, I've worked in Palestine, I've seen what it's like. It's unbelievable. So there's no discussion about that, really. It's not, well, actually, but the Israelis' point of view is this. Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll listen to that, shall we? No, we shouldn't listen to that. It's wrong, what they're doing, and it needs to be called out from what because if you allow an argument that defends and supports the action of the TPLF, for example, you create doubt in people's minds, and you create the possibility for wrongdoing to take place. There's no defense for what the TPLF did.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, we unfortunately we have to wrap this up. I could talk to you for another hour, and hopefully next time we actually will. But I think you're speaking to something really important. All you have to do damage in terms of obstructing the truth is just put a little doubt in it. Just a little doubt in it. And I think, to your point, neutrality is not a thing. Objectivity is a thing. People keep talking about neutrality in journalism, and I see it. I've been in the business for about 12 years, and there's this attempt to be neutral. And oftentimes when the story is high stakes and when we have enough data, and that's the approach, all it does is cast doubt on the truth in favor of the culprit.
Yeah, very well put, Amelie. Cast doubt on the truth. It's very true, and I think you're right. It needs to be objective, but the journalists and the editors aren't objective. They're conditioned, and that's what I'm trying to say. You have to see all of this within the context of the prevailing ideology. The dominant ideology, which is filled with certain narrow, reductive perspectives of what life's about, and what people are about. Africans are stupid, they're corrupt, and they're to blame for all their problems. Absolute rubbish. Completely false, untrue. And what Africa needs to do is reject the West completely. Reject the Western model, reject Western money, aid, it's not aid at all, and stand on its own. Unite, cooperate, come together, not in a structured way even. And that seems to me to be starting to happen. I know you with the No More movement is fantastic. The youth movements around the environment are incredibly powerful and energized. So there is this tremendous awakening of unity, and that's not just in Africa. And that was something I wanted to, if I've got 2 seconds, I'll just add that, if I may, that is, we are at a pivotal point, humanity. These are transitional times, and all the forces that we've been talking about, the media, these dried up imperial forces which have had their day, they are the reactionary forces of the world. They are not the progressive forces. They are not in tune with the sweeping energies of the time. Those sweeping energies of the time are based on unity, cooperation, tolerance, and mutual understanding. And where you see those groups coming together under those principles, you see the light and the hope of the future.
I love it. Okay, that's actually a really inspiring point to end, especially for those of us who are kind of just starting our day. Thank you so much, Graham Peebles, UK-based writer, writing on many issues, including on Ethiopia, as someone who's lived there and has a lot of ties there. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to do this again if that's okay with you.
Very nice to see you.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Bye.